Police Lieutenant Roy Tucker shouted just before pulling the trigger. He said, "With skin that dark, you're probably a prison escapee, not a soldier." Then he fired directly into the chest of the black woman standing at the checkpoint. She didn't resist. She didn't scream, but when her badge was soaked in blood, people finally realized she was a lieutenant colonel in the Army, previously awarded a top-secret strategic commendation by the Pentagon. And just 6 hours later, the man who gave the order to shoot was sentenced to death in a closed-door session. What state do you live in? If you witnessed that scene, would you dare look it in the eye? The night was as black as asphalt, and the city lights cast pale streaks of fluorescence across the windshield. Lieutenant Colonel Aaliyah Monroe drove with precision. Her posture was upright, her shoulders squared, her eyes sharp. She wore her full tactical uniform, not a single detail out of place. Battle dress camouflage crisp, nameplate aligned, strategic clearance badge hanging around her neck, glinting in the sodium glow of the traffic light as it flipped from yellow to red. Her right foot eased onto the brake with practiced calm, the vehicle halting precisely at the white line. It was discipline made visible. The silence inside her vehicle was pristine. No music, no idle thoughts. Her hands rested in textbook formation at 10 and 2, fingers lightly curled, thumbs pointing along the wheel's arc. Pure regulation. The soft hum of the engine was the only sound she allowed. Then, a high-pitched wail ruptured the stillness. Blue and red lights pulsed behind her. A police cruiser tailing from 3 cars back now lunged forward, siren cutting through the air like a blade. Aaliyah's jaw clenched for half a second. No panic. She guided the vehicle slowly toward the shoulder. Signal on. No sudden movements. She killed the engine, straightened her uniform collar with a minimal flick of her wrist. Her gaze remained forward. No slouch, no emotion, just procedure. The police cruiser halted behind her, headlights flooding her rear-view mirror in a blinding white blaze. A car door slammed. Heavy steps approached. The man who emerged moved like he'd done this 100 times and learned nothing from any of them. Sergeant Travis Larkin, thick-necked, standard-issue scowl, black gloves that creaked when his fists flexed. He approached with deliberate slowness, his boots grinding over the asphalt like a warning. Aaliyah watched him in the mirror. She knew the script, but this wasn't traffic enforcement. This was something else. The way his eyes tracked her silhouette before zeroing in on her nameplate told her everything. He stopped at her window, but didn't tap, didn't speak, just stared for 2 long seconds. Then finally, the rasp of knuckles on glass. She lowered it halfway. Standard protocol. Before she could speak, his voice sliced through. Monroe, huh? His tone was slick with something unspoken. Wearing that uniform doesn't make you a model citizen. That tag around your neck? Hell, I could print one of those online. His words hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Filthy, lingering, intended to sting. Aaliyah didn't flinch. Her expression didn't change. He leaned in closer. She could smell the sour caffeine and control on his breath. His gloved hand moved, slow and deliberate, up to her chest. Just enough to make the gesture seem official, just enough to be deniable. 2 fingers traced the edge of her nameplate, then flattened into a gloved palm. He pressed against it, dragging across the letters Monroe, like he was trying to erase them. Like touching it would diminish her. She didn't blink, didn't move. Her hands remained where they were, invisible, neutral, disciplined. The fabric beneath his glove remained still, but the tension in the air snapped tight like a tripwire. The insult wasn't in the words, it was in the gesture. The invasion, the mockery, is buried in the procedure. Larkin stepped back half a pace, a smirk curling his lip. License and registration now. Aaliyah moved with slow, controlled precision. Nothing rushed. She retrieved her identification, passing it out the window without a word. Her clearance level gleamed beside the eagle crest. His eyes flicked over it, then narrowed with skepticism manufactured for effect. Lieutenant Colonel, he read aloud, voice curling with disdain. Big title. Doesn't make you special out here. He said nothing. He wasn't here to verify anything. He was here to provoke. He made a show of looking over the papers, then handed them back like they were tainted. He didn't move away from the window. Where are you headed, Colonel? Base perimeter. Transporting strategic documentation. Her voice was clear, steady, not defiant, not afraid, pure military. Strategic, huh? He chuckled like it was a joke. That little black box under your passenger seat? You know, in the wrong neighborhood, people might think that's a weapon." He tilted his head. The smirk remained. Aaliyah's eyes met his, locked with precision. "It's a sealed lead container. Federal chain of custody protocol applies." He laughed again, softer this time, almost friendly, like mockery dressed up as casual banter. Then, without warning, he stepped back and motioned her out of the car. "Out. Now. Is there a charge? Did I stutter?" She opened the door, stepped out, slowly, controlled, boots touching ground, heel first, spine aligned. He watched her every movement like a predator clocking its prey. She faced him with her hands by her sides, visible, unthreatening, impeccably by the book. He circled once, then nodded toward the hood, face down, hands flat. She hesitated for half a breath, not from fear, but from calculation. Then she complied, leaned forward, palms on the cold metal. Her badge swung gently against her chest. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the paint. Behind her, his gloves creaked again. Footsteps rounded to the passenger side. The door opened with a jerk. He leaned in, yanked the box from beneath the seat, examined it like it was contraband. Then came the ripping sound, latex against canvas. He tore open her side satchel without a second glance at the insignia stitched across it. Papers spilled onto the street. Classified folders fluttered across the blacktop like wounded birds. One sheet skidded under her boot, another drifted toward the gutter. She didn't move, not an inch. Her gaze stayed fixed on a spot on the horizon, jaw set, shoulders steady. He returned to her side, breathing heavier now. Satisfaction was written in the set of his jaw. "Told you," he said, not even bothering to whisper. "The costume doesn't make you clean." He stepped closer again, too close, his voice lowered. "You think the badge makes you untouchable? You're still just another one of them." Well, a word sharper than any slur, a dismissal dressed as categorization, a slap without the motion. She didn't respond, didn't grant him the pleasure of a reaction. That silence, the absence of permission, of fear, of validation, was the only resistance she gave, and it was the one he couldn't stand. He spat to the side, then turned, gesturing like it was over. "Stay right there, I'll be back." She didn't move. Her hands remained planted. Her breathing was calm, but inside the tension coiled tight, like a fuse waiting for a spark. Not rage, not panic, precision, calculation. An entire war strategy condensed into bone and blood and stillness. Traffic passed behind them. Oblivious, civilians stared, saw a uniform and a badge, and drew conclusions designed by a broken system. The streetlight above changed again, red to green. The world moved forward, but Aaliyah Monroe held her position. Steel still, silent, a signal lost in the noise. A flash of white, the reflection of her nameplate in the cruiser's lights, slid down the black sheen of the hood like a tear that refused to fall, and the night watched in complicit quiet. The night did not blink. It remained complicit, draped in silence that refused to pass judgment, as Aaliyah stood like a monolith, hands planted on cold steel, eyes forward but nowhere in particular. The silence wasn't empty. It was sharpened, heavy, like a blade pressed against the air. Behind her, Larkin had not moved, not to leave, not to reconsider. What he lacked in justification, he compensated for with volume. The staccato of his boots on asphalt cracked through the dark as he circled back. "Out!" he barked again, even though she was already standing beside the car, as though his voice alone could force compliance from stone. "Face down. Capo. Now." There was no question, no explanation, no badge presented, no reason given, just the command, raw and abrupt, as if it came with divine authority. Aaliyah didn't challenge, she didn't argue. Her silence was not submission, it was calculation. She stepped forward and leaned down, palms spreading against the hood's sleek surface, body forming angles so precise they could be drawn with a ruler. She moved with the economy of someone trained not to waste motion, not to invite escalate. Her heart did not race. Her breath did not hitch. Stillness became her armor. Behind her, the shadow of Larkin swelled. He hovered close enough to let the heat of his contempt seep through his gloves. She didn't look up. didn't give him the humanity of eye contact. His voice coiled around her like smoke. "What's in the car?" he demanded. She answered evenly, voice cool and clipped like a switchblade. "I am transporting federal documentation. The sealed lead container is beneath the passenger seat." He snorted, an ugly sound full of disbelief. "Federal, huh? Big words for a little black box." He stepped to the side, the door creaking open under his grip. The cabin light flared against his sneer. "You know," he continued, tone dipping into theatrical mockery, "that metal case could hold anything. Could be an AK in there. Wouldn't be the first time someone like you hid behind a badge to haul something dirty." His gloved hands moved quickly now, not with protocol, but with purpose. The latex scraped fabric, tore seams, and shredded the chain of custody with each tug. The satchel under the seat was yanked open without hesitation. He plunged a hand inside like a butcher, elbow deep in flesh. Folders came spilling out, a burst of clipped wings and ink, government stamps falling like bruises against the pavement. He didn't pause to read, didn't stop to verify, just tossed and scattered, tearing through decades of precision and clearance as if it were wrapping paper. Papers flew across the road. One caught wind and spun away under a tire. Another landed at Aaliyah's boot, trembling like it knew it didn't belong there. Still, she did not move. He emerged with the lead box, held it at arm's length as if it might bite him. "This," he said, grinning now, "this little treasure chest?" His voice was acidic, a snake's hiss dipped in arrogance. "Yeah, I could fit a whole damn Kalashnikov in here." He gave it a shake, reckless, performative, insulting. The impact of his disregard echoed louder than the sirens had. The contents of that case were not just files. They were coded entries, layers of access, pieces of a mechanism designed to launch a response in the event of satellite assault. It wasn't what he accused, it was what he trivialized. She finally spoke, but didn't lift her head. "You are violating federal protocol. You are interfering with a Level 5 clearance delivery." He laughed, not because it was funny, but because he could. "Level 5? Lady, you don't get to bring your little war games into my jurisdiction." He took a step closer, the case still dangling in one hand like a dead fish. "You think you're some kind of hero because you wear camo and stand straight? Let me tell you something." He leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper of venom. "You ain't special, you ain't safe, and you sure as hell ain't above suspicion." He opened the back door of her vehicle and tossed the box in like garbage. Then he turned and slammed her passenger door so hard the windows shook. She didn't flinch. She didn't so much as blink. He came back around, exhaled long and slow through his nose, and stood behind her, looming. He wanted her to move, to twitch, to break formation, but she remained a statue carved from defiance. A few hundred yards away, just beyond the checkpoint, an officer in an unmarked vehicle stared down a digital map. Aaliyah Monroe's vehicle icon had stopped moving 7 minutes ago. The officer glanced at the base gate's clock. She was late. That didn't happen. Not with her. The protocol kicked in. Silent alert. No sirens. No blinking lights. Just a shift in data. Location locked. Movement monitored. Back at the shoulder of the road, Larkin muttered something under his breath, low and jagged, then spat at the ground like he could cleanse himself of her presence. He walked to his cruiser, radio crackling with static. He didn't call it in, didn't log the stop. This wasn't about the law. This was about dominance, about reducing something precise and powerful into a mess he could feel superior to. She stayed still. Her breath was even, her frame unmoved. It wasn't restraint. It was resistance at the molecular level. She didn't fold because he wanted her to. She didn't protest because he expected her to. Her silence was a statement. "I do not yield to noise. I do not dance to your chaos. I will not become what you accuse." He returned with a flashlight now, sweeping it pointlessly across the interior, knowing full well what he was doing was outside procedure. Each beam of light was another insult, each flicker another message. You don't belong here. But she knew where she belonged. Her badge wasn't just a symbol, it was clearance, authority, function. It was a legacy. It was an oath. She turned her head half an inch, enough to see him in her peripheral vision. "Are we finished, Sergeant?" she asked. Not defiantly, but directly. Her voice was clean, cold, a scalpel slicing through his theatrics. Larkin stared at her for a second longer than necessary. Then slowly he straightened. "You'll hear from internal," he muttered. "Transporting federal materials without an escort? We'll see what sticks." She said nothing. There was nothing to say. He wasn't her superior. He wasn't her equal. He was a delay, a malfunction in the system. And systems, she knew, could be corrected. He walked away like he'd won something. She stood there like she'd built something. Behind her, the papers on the ground fluttered and fell still. In the distance, headlights shimmered. The base waited, and somewhere in a surveillance feed, her position had already triggered escalation. The night was no longer quiet. It had become a witness. The weight of the night had shifted, not by sound or wind or passing time, but by something more primal, an undercurrent thickening in the silence. Aaliyah still held position, body angled with military exactness against the hood, breath calm, presence unbroken. The wind grazed the sleeves of her uniform, pulling at fibers worn from deployments and duty, yet her posture remained a monument. Behind her, Sergeant Travis Larkin's footsteps dragged back toward the front, uneven, hostile. He was done pretending. His voice cracked the still air again, sharp and volatile. "Turn around. Hands up." She moved in silence, the way a blade moves when drawn. Clean, direct, unapologetic. Her hands lifted into the air with the same deliberateness she used in combat briefings. Fingers spread to show zero intent. She turned slowly, revealing her chest, her rank, her face, all of it underlined by composure carved in granite. The glint of her strategic clearance badge caught a flicker of light, dangling over the emblem sewn across her uniform, USS Army. For a moment, time should have paused. Instead, Larkin drew. "Don't move," he screamed, voice cracking with false urgency. The gun was already up, barrel locked to target. But she wasn't moving. She hadn't flinched. Her hands were still raised, still open, still steady. The command was hollow. There was no delay, no build-up, no further warning. The shot detonated into the air, a brutal punctuation. The round struck her in the chest, high left, precisely beside the badge that bore her strategic designation. The sound rang louder than physics allowed, like the world itself had gasped. Her body jolted backward. The air snapped from her lungs. She staggered, her boots dragging an inch against the asphalt before she collapsed. Not a fall, a controlled surrender to gravity. She landed on her side, one arm still lifted halfway, the other pulling close to the source of pain. Her breath trembled once, shallow and fleeting, but her face didn't contort. No scream, no collapse of dignity, just blood, thick and arterial. It oozed from beneath the shredded fabric of her uniform, soaking through the tactical green and turning it to mud brown. The red bled fast. It slid down her torso in narrow rivulets, flowing from the puncture beside her badge, staining the cotton threads of U.S. Army until the white embroidery turned rust. Her fingers, still curved into the shape of formality, pressed faintly against the wound. Not clutching, not panicking, just maintaining the line, the protocol, the symbol of order. Even as her chest rose and fell like the final drumbeat of a funeral cadence, her hand stayed in that soldier's posture, as if she were still waiting to report. Larkin didn't run, he didn't kneel, he didn't offer aid. He stood above her, gun still smoking, and scoffed. "Black in uniform," he sneered, voice dripping with venom. "Just another way to dodge a rap sheet. Everybody knows it." His words didn't hang in the air, they carved into it. He looked down at her like she was nothing more than a casualty of pretense. Just another uniform he didn't recognize as real. Just another nameplate he wanted to erase. There was no regret, no shock, only the trembling excitement of someone who thought he'd asserted truth through force. Aaliyah blinked once. Her pupils didn't tremble. Her body was losing heat, but her presence hadn't dimmed. Her blood was painting the street now, edging toward the gutter in a thin trail, but her left hand still flexed as if gripping the memory of a salute. Her legs curled slightly, involuntarily, but her spine refused to break form. The badge around her neck was dented from the shot's impact, but the clearance code was still visible, half obscured by viscous red. The star above the lettering LV5 Strategic shimmered faintly under the street lamp, as if refusing to fade. Barkin shifted his stance. The weight of his holster seemed lighter now. He looked down at the pool forming beneath her, as though it were a stain he couldn't wash out. The smell of iron crept upward, sharp and metallic. He exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable, then holstered his weapon with an ease that bordered on smug. There were no words from Aaliyah. None were needed. Her silence screamed. Her stillness indicated. Her blood spelled out something no report could redact. Even as the pressure in her lungs began to falter, she kept that look, the one forged in field operations and strategic briefings, the look of a soldier who dies facing forward. On the nearby hill, traffic continued to move. No one slowed. No one knew. The world was still rotating, oblivious to the injustice that had just echoed through the bones of asphalt and concrete. One drop of blood trailed from her mouth. Her lips, closed tight, refused to grant a final breath to someone like him. Her story was not for him. Her end, if it came, would not belong to his narrative. Her body remained there, unmoving, locked in a position of readiness, even as life slipped second by second through the wound on her chest. The olive-green fabric darkened with every heartbeat, the red-consuming regulation lines like ink-blotting doctrine. The nameplate was stained but legible. Monroe, a name he had tried to touch, to degrade, now immortalized by the stain he inflicted, and beneath it a hand, curled, blood-soaked, still flexed, as if waiting to be called on. 12 seconds. That's all it took for the world to shift. Not with a scream or a siren, but with a blink from an unblinking eye. The traffic surveillance unit mounted at the far end of the overpass, silent, static, invisible to the living but loyal to its programming. It had no opinions, no bias, no fear, just frames, time-stamped, auto-archived, embedded with metadata. And there it was. The exact moment Aaliyah Monroe raised both hands into the air, elbows unbent, palms open, expression calm. The exact moment she complied, the moment that invalidated everything that followed. The time-stamped read 2:17 and 12 seconds. The frame was crisp. Aaliyah's head was tilted slightly, a motion that seemed almost curious, as if asking without words whether humanity was still possible on this stretch of asphalt. Her eyes were fixed forward, piercing the lens not with pleading, but with a demand, "See me, understand what you're about to allow." And then the shot followed. Another camera, this one mounted on a security cruiser stationed near the base perimeter, caught the event through a reflective panel angled off a passing sedan. It wasn't meant to record anything specific, it was just another set of digital eyes trained toward nothing. But sometimes, nothing is where truth hides best. The mirror glare, distorted by motion, bent the image, but didn't erase it. The gun was visible, so was the impact. The spread of blood was a halo, dark and growing. These feeds, harmless, neutral, dull, were pulled into review within minutes. Standard protocol. Every incident logged near a base triggers internal security checks. A junior analyst named buried in acronyms and badge numbers loaded the clips without expectation. He watched it once, then again, then a third time without breathing. He said nothing, just clipped the files, embedded the raw timestamp, and burned a silent copy. Not for protocol, for a friend. He didn't leak it with drama. There was no manifesto, no email chain, just a message sent in a private group chat with one sentence. "This isn't a glitch." The video hit the net with surgical speed. No headline, just the footage, no edits, no commentary, no rage, just a fact. And that, in its cold neutrality, lit the fuse. The sound wasn't important. The images said everything. The freeze frame that stopped hearts came at second 12. Aaliyah, full frame, arms raised, head slightly tilted, eyes not wide with terror but locked in unwavering clarity. Blood had not yet broken skin. The gun had not yet been fired. The look on her face, the refusal to cower, was more damning than any bullet. It spread through secure servers, first gate personnel, federal lines, and watchdog networks. Then it hit civilian networks. Then it hit everything. Re-uploads, duplicates, screen records. It survived takedown orders, bounced between continents. Nothing could stop it. Truth rarely can once it escapes the firewall. Somewhere in the audio overlay, buried in scrambled dispatch chatter, a single voice slid through, smug and sharp. Larkin's voice without disguise. "She doesn't look dangerous, but they never do they?" Static. Then a chuckle. "They never warn you before they snap." It was enough. He hadn't said her name. He didn't need to. The world knew her now. Not as a victim, not yet, but as the first page in a file that couldn't be buried. The camera didn't lie. It didn't feel either. It simply did its job. And that made its evidence more pure than any witness, more damning than any testimony, because it didn't blink. It didn't shout. It didn't scream for justice. It just showed the moment the line was crossed. By morning, news outlets were scrambling for context. Officials stalled for statements. Lawyers rehearsed for damage control. But the public didn't need a verdict. They had already seen enough, and what they saw was clear. Compliance met with violence, calm answered by bullets, dignity shattered not by resistance, but by expectation. And always, second 12, replayed, zoomed, memed, analyzed, paused. Aaliyah Monroe, unarmed, unmoving, unflinching, head tilted, eyes locked, a figure cast in calm defiance. Not shocked, not scared, just aware. The 12th second had been replayed across 1,000 screens, dissected in digital forensics labs and data briefings. But it wasn't just an image of injustice. It was a warning signal that triggered protocols beyond the reach of headlines. Somewhere beyond the bandwidth of civilian outrage, the military systems buried deep within the United States Strategic Command lit up like a wound. At 2:17 and 46 seconds, an alert blared through Tier 3 communications. One of the 3 priority access keys to immediate strategic response protocol had gone silent. The AI didn't hesitate. It didn't question or consider human error. The system only knew parameters, pulse signals, biometrics, GPS stability, and encryption signatures. And one of them had vanished. One of 3. That was enough. Command channels blinked into lockdown mode. The name tied to that missing signal was cross-referenced and flagged. LT Colonel Aaliyah Monroe, clearance level 5, strategic division, top-tier countermeasure authorization. Her identity wasn't just a name on a roster. It was the spine of a defense framework. Her biometric code unlocked 1/3 of the deadliest arsenal on Earth. Nuclear readiness was no longer a Cold War relic. It was a digital reflex, and Aaliyah had been hardwired into that reflex as a primary conduit. The moment her signal vanished, the protocols executed their cascade. Red lock on all nodes connected to her device tree. Encryption refresh halted. Satellite command link paused. Even the failsafe needed her code to reset, and the clock was now ticking. Inside the control chamber, beneath a mountain range facility known only to 6 people, a lieutenant with gray eyes and a pulse monitor clamped to his wrist whispered into his headset, "Confirming strategic handler Delta is offline. Visual tracking Nes-Ot responding. Last known note, Urban Sector 5, civilian territory." The colonel, 3 seats down, didn't bother with protocol. He slammed his hand against the red-line console and turned to the director of strategic integrity. "If she's dead, we've got 14 minutes to find a substitute handler. And in 14 minutes, a satellite-based strike sequence can be halfway through our sky." The director didn't blink. He issued a single command. Initiate asset integrity seal. Full environment lockdown. All data on Monroe is now Tier 0. No external access. No review permissions. Across the eastern grid, every record tied to Aaliyah's operational activities went black. The base where she had once stood tall sealed her communications. Her vehicle's internal logs encrypted themselves. The ID scanners she'd pinged during access last week wiped non-essential metadata. Only one feed remained, an internal camera mounted inside a high-level transport vehicle, the last place she was seen before the shooting. The system zoomed in, slowly, clinically. No music, no commentary. Just a machine doing its job. Frame by frame, the resolution climbed until one detail filled the screen. Her nameplate, drenched in blood, but legible. Monroe. Beneath that, in thin metallic print, the tag read, Clearance, LV5, Strategic. The blood hadn't blurred it. If anything, it highlighted it. The crimson streak had run across the letters like a line drawn for emphasis, not erasure, a visual timestamp of consequence. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was the fail point of a continent-wide defense algorithm. From inside the Situation Room at a facility no news anchor had ever seen, an operator fed new data into the contingency model. Heart rate pattern interrupted, cellular tether terminated. Encrypted mission code pending status. The AI continued recalibrating scenarios. Each time it ran the model without her, the risk increased exponentially. The system flashed yellow, then orange. There was no red. Red meant launch. The commander-in-chief had not been informed. Not yet. This wasn't a human decision. This was numbers, probabilities, and autonomous protocols developed during the most paranoid years of military programming. Human oversight had only one function now, to stop the cascade before red. But without Aaliyah, there was no stop code. In a dark room 2 levels below, the senior cyber analyst activated Protocol Lock Mirror, a total freeze on all national database links connected to her operational ID, from background checks to tax records. Every file tagged A. Monroe was now in deep quarantine. Even civilian hospital registries couldn't access her status. One of the systems flagged an anomaly. An AI-generated message appeared. Strategic signature incomplete. Biolink dormant. Code authority critical. In the language of the system, she wasn't dead. She was neither dead nor alive. She was missing. And that state of not knowing was worse, because it left room for failure, room for breach, room for the one thing the system could not compute: uncertainty. In the western sky, a weather satellite continued its passive arc. Embedded within it, a dormant defense protocol remained idle, but not asleep. Nothing in orbit sleeps. Meanwhile, in the alley where her blood still darkened the pavement, sirens began to approach, not from civilian responders, but from the base's rapid response unit. The AI had authorized the mobilization before anyone had called for help. They weren't coming to rescue a soldier. They were coming to locate the only person who could stop the clock. There are no windows in the room where nations decide who lives and who disappears. The walls are thick, lined with fibers that drink sound and steel that deflect consequence. It is not a place for apologies. It is a place for action. And at 3:08, precisely 51 minutes after Colonel Aaliyah Monroe's signal vanished, that room lit up, not with emergency, but with deliberation. The table was rectangular, edges beveled like a coffin lid. 5 men sat on one side, each in uniform, medals stitched like scars across their chests. At the head sat the Secretary of Strategic Defense, sleeves rolled, eyes unreadable. No one took notes. No one asked for coffee. This wasn't diplomacy. This was internal warfare. A single screen displayed 3 options. The first, de-escalate and neutralize internally. The second, public sanction of civil law enforcement. The third, invoke Article 34A, Strategic Asset Violation Response. Only one mattered. The footage had already been reviewed. No one debated the image. No one needed more angles. The second 12 had said everything. Hands up, heads still, blood pending, and beside it a single line from the internal AI flagged in red. Handler Delta. Signal lost. Code chain interrupted. The Pentagon doesn't operate in emotion. It operates in probability. And probability now dictated that if Monroe's attacker went unpunished, the deterrent matrix for civilian interference in defense protocol would collapse. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about the algorithm. The secretary broke the silence first. We have 14 minutes in the event of an orbital assault. That window shrinks if anyone with a badge feels free to disrupt our chain of command. A general at the far end grunted. This wasn't a disruption. It was a shot across the entire chain. If we blink, we lose the military-civilian firewall. Another voice, clipped and brutal. Civilian law doesn't cover what just happened. It wasn't excessive force, it was strategic sabotage. The room didn't nod. It didn't breathe. The secretary looked down at a thin dossier marked TL. Inside, one photograph, one page of service history, one bullet casing retrieved at the scene. He closed the folder. Options? The answers came without delay. Article 34A, immediate revocation, special jurisdiction clearance override, terminate under internal defense clause. No one raised their voice, no one postured, there were no lectures on justice, no hand-wringing about optics. This wasn't a debate, it was judgment. The secretary nodded once. Final vote? All 5 hands lifted, then came down, palm first, flat, thunderous, slamming against the surface of the table with military synchronization. The sound was singular, not a clap, a strike, the kind of sound you make when you close the door on someone's name. That was it. No applause, no gavel, no transcript, just 5 palms, 1 table, and the quiet that follows when a death warrant is signed not in ink but in silence. He leaned back in his chair. Effective immediately, revoke civilian protections from Subject Larkin. Reclassify under wartime judicial purview. Do not process through federal court. Do not alert state channels. Lock it inside the system. One of the generals added, voice devoid of irony. If we don't handle one bad cop, someone out there will start handling entire chains of command. Another murmured, and then we won't be writing protocols. We'll be writing eulogies. A final confirmation rippled through encrypted command nodes. Larkin's ID pinged red. His law enforcement credentials triggered a forced expiration. Background checks, access codes, weapons clearance, all marked invalid. An invisible firewall sprang up around his existence. He was still alive, technically, but the system had already begun to forget him. There was no press release, no PR strategy, no internal memo, just 3 lines of classified action: revoke, reclassify, remove. Outside, dawn was still hours away, but the machine had moved, not with mercy, not with malice, but with precision. That's how empires respond when their inner codes are touched by civilian hands. They moved in just after 4 o'clock IEM, when even the city's paranoia was asleep. No sirens, no red and blue strobe, no knock on the door. The van was matte gray, marked only with an internal operations seal unreadable at speed. It rolled through quiet residential streets like a whisper dipped in steel. Larkin's house was a 1-story colonial with a porch light still burning, an empty ritual clinging to the illusion of security. Inside, he was half-dressed, barefoot, cup of stale coffee in hand, watching reruns of a procedural show that looked quaint compared to what was about to happen. He didn't see them coming. He never would. The front door didn't open. It collapsed inward. The first step wasn't hesitation. It was possession. They were not police. They didn't wear blue. They wore black fatigues with no names, no rank, no insignia, just authority woven into fabric. 4 soldiers entered in a perfect diamond formation, each with eyes cold and unflinching, each trained for a single kind of encounter, final. Larkin jumped back, and the mug shattered on the tile. What the hell? He started, but the first operative was already on him, voice like a blade. S.G.T. Travis Larkin, you are under immediate military apprehension under Strategic Enforcement Protocol. He stumbled, reached for nothing in particular, mouth flailing for words he thought still meant something. You can't. I'm a cop. I have rights. The answer came not in words but in movement, a blur of bodies. 1 step, 1 twist, 1 pivot. The takedown was surgical. It took 3 seconds, no more. 1 arm behind his back, 1 knee to his spine, the other arm pinned to the floor. His cheek kissed hardwood, exactly the way he used to slam others down. Now, it was his turn to inhale dust. He growled, a pathetic, breathless thing. "I have rights," he gasped again. A soldier knelt beside him, voice unshaken. "You had rights. They were revoked the moment you fired on a federal asset." The cuffs clicked into place, heavy, black, reinforced with internal sensors. Not a police issue, no keys. Only code unlock, a tool designed for battlefield captures, not suburban tantrums. They hoisted him upright with the grace of machines, dragged him toward the doorway, not bothering to let him walk. His legs scraped the floor, arms locked, dignity shredded. There were no body cams, no Miranda warning, no civilian oversight. This wasn't a precinct procedure. This was military reckoning. Outside, a second team swept the perimeter. No neighbors looked out. Phones within a 1-mile radius had been jammed. Power lines were temporarily rerouted. The entire block was frozen in time, a surgical theater of jurisdiction where only one body was scheduled for removal. Larkin screamed again, defiant but fading. "You can't do this. I'm protected under state law." The lead operative looked back once. "State law doesn't govern war zones, and you created one the moment you aimed at Strategic Command." They threw him into the van, face down, cuffed behind, breathing hard, eyes wide. He looked up and finally understood. This wasn't an arrest. It was erasure. His phone had already gone dark. His badge had expired. His sidearm, left on the nightstand, had been disabled remotely through serial ID locks. The network had amputated him like a limb gone septic. As the van door slammed shut, the last thing visible was his living room floor. A scuffed line marked where his face had met the wood, the same place he'd forced countless others. The symmetry was cruel and exact. The van didn't speed. It didn't need to. The outcome was already coded, encrypted, and set into motion. As it moved through back channels and military-only access lanes, Sergeant Travis Larkin sat cuffed and silent, not because he chose to be, but because the air around him had changed. This wasn't transportation to a court. It wasn't even a transfer of custody. It was a reclassification, and he was no longer a subject of civil law. He was a corrupted variable being deleted from a network that no longer had a use for him. They didn't take him to jail. They took him to a facility that didn't exist on state records, nestled between two abandoned silos in a quadrant redacted from every public map. The gates didn't creak. They hissed, opening with the sound of airtight seals releasing. No guards were waiting, only black-suited operatives and a biometric scanner that didn't beep. It confirmed. His existence was now purely physical, and even that was temporary. They marched him inside. He tried to ask where they were going, what charges were being filed. No one answered. There were no charges. There would be no hearing. The hallway swallowed him whole. One door, one chair, one panel. His face was scanned, not for verification, but for final archival. Then it began, the deletion. In a secured server, buried under 20 feet of reinforced concrete, Larkin's citizen ID was marked, terminated under Protocol 34A strategic breach. From that instant, the system reacted like a body rejecting a toxin. His social security number was voided. His banking records froze. Medical files returned a 404 error. Payrolls, tax filings, real estate records, all flagged in red and queued for erasure. Across the Department of Justice's digital backend, his personnel file blinked once. Then it turned gray. A minute later, it vanished. An automated message flagged it. Subject does not qualify for civilian due process. In the Department of Defense's mainframe, his badge number returned a null. It no longer matched any system access node. Internal security logs showed his login credentials as fraudulent. His weapons certification expired retroactively. Surveillance profiles recategorized his digital footprint from law enforcement to rogue element, strategic misconduct. And then that category itself collapsed. In short, he was not being punished. He was being undone. They moved fast. A backbend security engineer removed his access from the federal watchtower. the network that tracks all internal law enforcement positions. When they keyed his name into the registry, 22 minutes later, it responded, "No, subject by that identifier." Back in the holding cell, he began to shout again. Rage, this time. Not the theatrical kind. This was confusion, deep and feral. "I want a lawyer. I want a hearing. You can't do this." The operative outside didn't even flinch. He didn't look through the reinforced glass. He just spoke, tone flat. "This isn't a prison. This is the end of procedural relevance." Larkin pounded the wall. "You can't erase me." But even his voice felt small now. The room absorbed it. There were no echoes. The environment was engineered to make noise meaningless. On a screen inside an isolated operations center, a feed displayed a list of names. His blinked once, pixelated, then began to fade. Not disappear instantly, but dissolve. Line by line, record by record, like a corrupted file being scrubbed from a national hard drive. By the time the cursor reached the final entry, his training certification from 21 years ago, the screen read, "No record found." His existence was now undocumented, not dead, just undefined. His family could not reach him. Mail sent to his address would be returned, marked recipient not valid. The bank account holding his pension was dissolved into administrative seizure. He no longer showed up in background checks, triggering alerts on facial recognition systems. His badge would now scan as counterfeit. The next morning, an internal memo went out, not to the media, not to the public, but to high-sensitive clearance holders across federal intelligence branches. It contained one sentence: "Subject Larkin is no longer within the framework of civilian recognition." It didn't mean he'd escaped, it meant he'd been erased. There was no docket, no clerk, no gavel. What waited for Larkin wasn't justice, it was judgment streamlined. He was taken from his containment chamber and escorted down a corridor so sterile it felt post-human. The silence was mechanical. The guards on either side didn't touch him, didn't speak. He wasn't a prisoner. He was an obsolete function in the process of being terminated. The door at the end of the hallway hissed open, not as an invitation, but as automation. He stepped inside. The room was cavernous, stark and cold. Walls of brushed steel swallowed light. No windows, no clocks. A single raised platform extended across the far wall, 5 chairs perched on a ledge 3 feet higher than the floor. The tribunal sat like statues, framed by a backlight that made faces indistinct but posture unmistakable. These were not people, these were sentences waiting to be spoken. Larkin was led to the center of the floor, alone. No podium, no table, no defense counsel. A single circle marked on the floor defined his place. He stepped into it, and the guards vanished behind him, the door sealing with a soft finality. He opened his mouth to speak. A light blinked red above him. No verbal input authorized. A voice boomed from above, not from a person, but from the system itself, emotionless and resolved. SGT, Travis Larkin, you have been summoned under Military Justice Directive 34A. Due to the nature of the breach and its impact on national strategic integrity, this tribunal does not recognize your eligibility for civil defense. Larkin stared up, teeth clenched. This is illegal. Another red flash. Objection no. Subject lacks standing within military judiciary. He stood there, fists trembling, silence forced upon him not by fear, but by architecture. Then the screen behind the tribunal flickered to life. The first video played, dash cam footage, unaltered, unedited. The stop, the commands, the silence, the shot, Aaliyah's body collapsing, the badge hitting pavement, the blood spreading. No sound accompanied it. The image was enough. The second video followed. Surveillance feed from the traffic camera. The now infamous 12th second. Arms raised, head tilted, eyes forward, no threat. Just clarity. Just comply. The screen faded to black. The voice returned. You are not here to be heard. You are not here to explain. You are here to be informed. A pause. The room grew quieter. You are not being tried, you are being sentenced. From above, a general leaned forward. His face came partially into view, carved from years of command. He didn't look angry, he looked finished. Your actions interrupted a classified command link. compromised strategic readiness, and inflicted bodily harm upon a Level 5 military asset during active transport. By protocol, your civilian protections are forfeit. Your rank is void. Your oaths are dissolved. You are no longer a participant in any branch of the law. Larkin's breath was ragged, caught between disbelief and desperation. Still, he said nothing. He wasn't allowed. The general continued. In the name of exceptional justice, you are hereby removed from further consideration within civil or military authority. Execution protocol is scheduled. You will not return to society. You will not receive an appeal. Another voice, softer but with iron beneath it. This isn't punishment. This is closure. Then came the final words, cold and precise. Remove the subject. Larkin didn't fight. What would be the point? The door opened behind him, and two figures stepped forward, clad in the same matte jacket fabric as the ones who had taken him. They did not rush. They did not announce. They simply took his arms, and the floor beneath him vanished, metaphorically and almost physically. He was no longer a name, he was a placeholder. And in that room, the 5 tribunal members stood and walked away without a glance back. Their decision has already been archived. Their role is complete. The room emptied with mechanical finality. No judgment lingered, no debate remained. What had been called a tribunal was, in practice, the last flicker of protocol before silence took over. Larkin was escorted back through corridors that seemed longer now, though nothing had changed except the permanence of his fate. His footsteps didn't echo. The air absorbed everything. The walls weren't meant to intimidate, they were designed to erase. He was not returned to a cell. There was no purpose. Instead, he was taken to a transport bay, strapped into a seat with no insignia, no call sign, no markings. The aircraft lifted quietly, slicing through clouds in a flight plan invisible to civilian radar. Destination? A decommissioned testing facility deep in the Nevada desert, no longer listed in any operational archive, now repurposed for the rare moments when someone needed to be disappeared, not with spectacle, but with certainty. There were no guards on arrival, no metal detectors, no cameras, just a single hallway stretching from tarmac to interior, a concrete throat that swallowed him into oblivion. He walked between 2 officers in black who never spoke, never touched him. Their presence was not protection, it was closure. The only sound was the electric hum of the corridor's lights, pulsing softly like a hospital on sleep mode. In the final room, the walls were white, not bright, not sterile, but empty, void of design, void of meaning. There was a desk. On it, one sheet of paper, centered with mathematical precision. A pen lay horizontal beneath the line where a signature was expected. They did not ask him to read it, they did not explain, but the title was clear, printed in red over the government seal. Permanent removal from public record. Consented closure. It wasn't an execution order, it was a digital death warrant. Signing the paper would not spare him, it would not delay the sentence. It was symbolic, the final step of internal compliance. One last lie told to bureaucracy so the system could believe itself still procedural. He stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he signed. The pen clicked softly. One of the officers collected the page. The other pointed toward a small door, barely human-sized. It opened into an airlock. No buttons, no handles. He stepped inside. A voice, synthetic and clean, sounded from above. Subject, Travis Larkin. You are no longer in the custody of any recognized department. You have been transitioned to Protocol 29. No statements, no appeals, no record of execution will exist. This is not secrecy. This is a structural correction. He said nothing. His silence wasn't stoic. It was vacant. There was no one left to convince. No cause left to defend. The chamber is sealed. Lights dimmed. He waited. Somewhere beyond those walls, a countdown began. Not one was visible to him. Not even necessary. The system did not need his fear to function. The final act had no witnesses. No last meal. No blindfold, no prayers, just time, swallowed in protocol. And then, like the collapsing of a file folder from a desktop, he was gone. Not a name, not a man, just the 29th hour of a country rewriting its definition of threat. There was no last meal, no priest, no letter to write, no hand to hold. Travis Larkin's final journey began not with the clang of steel doors, but with the muted hiss of hydraulics behind a wall that didn't open. It disappeared. The path ahead was a tunnel carved not from concrete, but from protocol, its silence louder than any siren. No guards escorted him in formation. Two figures in unmarked uniforms walked behind him, not to protect, not to witness, but to verify completion. They didn't speak, and neither did he. There was no need. In this place, words had long lost jurisdiction. The hallway bent twice, precisely, like the neck of a question mark. But there would be no question. Fluorescent lights pulsed in rhythms of silent decisions, casting a sterile glow over the walls which bore no insignia, no direction, no sign of origin. As he walked, Larkin's boots echoed faintly, the sound swallowed quickly by the depth of engineered stillness. The floor was cold, but not metallic, cushioned not for comfort, but to prevent the recording of unnecessary sound. Even here, efficiency reigned over humanity. He was ushered into a chamber no larger than an elevator shaft, square and symmetrical, painted in matte graphite. It absorbed light like regret absorbs time. In the center stood a single chair, not bolted, not bound, but there as if waiting for a man who already no longer existed. Behind it, engraved into the wall in characters so stark they seemed chiseled into thought itself, read the line, "Unauthorized actions against strategic asset 1." It was not a warning, it was a verdict. Larkin stood still, his breath slow but not defiant. There was no protest left in him, only the dry calculus of consequence. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness required recognition, and this place recognized nothing but alignment or error. He turned slightly, almost lazily, like a man flipping through the last few pages of his irrelevance. His voice, when it came, wasn't fear or fury. It was something colder, a kind of pride trying to outrun its expiration. "I wore the badge," he muttered, eyes scanning the room like a hunter robbed of prey. "I enforced the law, the right kind, my kind." There was no response. He sneered, eyes narrowing. "You think this erases me, buries me in some hole so deep no one remembers?" Still nothing. But the walls didn't need to answer. They had already spoken in silence, louder than any courtroom could. The moment he sat, the chair hummed gently, locking into place not with shackles, but with geometry. A click, then a pause. Then the wall opposite split open, not revealing a weapon or a firing squad, but a narrow aperture, the kind designed for precision, not spectacle. This was not punishment, it was a deletion. A red diode lit above the aperture, steady and unblinking. The silence pressed in like gravity. Then came the voice, one voice, from nowhere, from everywhere. "From this point forward, you are no longer law enforcement. You are no longer a citizen, you are a system error." The diode pulsed once. There was no countdown, no dramatic escalation, no breath held by bystanders, no camera to witness it, no script to read from. The bullet left the chamber with no sound, traveling faster than air could remember. It entered the side of his skull, not through the temple, but just beneath the bone, the way a needle slides into silence. His head jerked, not violently, just enough to remind the room that momentum still mattered. He died instantly. The chair didn't release him. The body sat, sagged, waited. 47 seconds later, a new door opened, thinner, mechanical, leading into a smaller chamber behind the wall. Two figures stepped in. No medical gloves, no stretchers, just precision. They lifted the body with practiced ease, not relevant, not careless, just correct. His body was transferred into a horizontal metal container, the inside lined with thermal insulation and a sealed coil system. No name tag, no tracking number, just a barcode that read ER43/pot oil. The container rolled forward on a silent track, vanishing into a doorway shaped not like death, but like deletion. Inside, an automated chamber activated. Compression, combustion, eradication. There was no visible flame, no burst, just light, a dull pulsing red glow, barely perceptible like the flicker of a system error warning across a terminal. Minutes passed. Then, a small panel hissed open and released a square metallic box, unmarked, matte gray, warm to the touch. Inside, only ash, no teeth, no jewelry, no DNA, just the remainder of a mistake. That box was placed into another crate, this one black, sealed, and reinforced. On its lid, a single phrase was stamped: "Do not return classified excess." There was no recipient, no ceremony. The crate was placed inside an automated delivery chute, one of hundreds, designed to move classified materials to zones no public registry could access. Outside, far above ground, in the Nevada desert, silent, barren, exposed, a thin chimney protruded from the rock. It had no markings, no smoke, no odor, just a single light at the top, glowing red, flashing once every 20 seconds, like the heartbeat of a system that has corrected itself. Back underground, the chamber was cleaned automatically. Sensors wiped memory from the room. Air composition reset, sound buffers cleared, data sequences overwritten. Not a single trace of Travis Larkin remained. Not a hair, not a fingerprint, not a whisper of warmth in the walls. Even the chair retracted into the floor, leaving behind a perfectly smooth surface, as though the event had never occurred. Above ground, somewhere in a government facility 2 time zones away, a line of code executed automatically, deactivating every digital reference associated with his name. Not suspended, not archived, purged, birth certificate, driving records, pension history, patrol logs, facial ID matches. Everything collapsed into zero. And then the final step. The Department of Defense terminal, classified access only, displayed a single prompt. Target E43 states. The cursor blinked. A technician pressed one key, verbed, not to be referenced. The screen faded to black. In the world above, no one noticed. There were no protests, no press briefings, no leaked photos, just one less name on one less list. A variable removed before it could corrupt the equation. Even his death certificate didn't use a name, just an alias ID. Just a checkbox under cause of termination. Protocol 34A, Strategic Integrity Enforcement. Far away, the lone chimney in the desert blinked red once more and then stopped, because it didn't need to say anything else, because the system had spoken, not with words, but with erasure. And the man who once touched a soldier's name tag with arrogance now existed only as heat, light, and ash, scattered in a place so precise not even memory dared to follow. The desert chimney no longer blinked. Its final pulse had faded, its work complete, its presence irrelevant. Below it, the chamber had retracted into stillness, the chair absorbed by seamless floors and the walls cleansed of every echo. But deletion inside the earth was never the end, only the beginning of erasure above it. Protocol 34A was never about vengeance. It was about silence, cold, systemic, surgical silence. Within 4 hours of the procedure, a sealed memo left the Joint Command servers of the Department of Defense. It carried the clearance tag, Total Removal, Category Null, and its content was not an announcement, but an instruction. Travis Michael Larkin, former police sergeant, was to be obliterated from every register, archive, credential, certification, award, pension, and transaction system linked to the federal government. The command was not routed through any civilian interface. It bypassed standard deletion protocols and went straight into black-level obfuscation, where data does not disappear, it is overridden by absence. First came the birth records. The registrar in Tallahassee received an automated sync from the National Vital Statistics System, flagging one entry as corrupted. The digital entry was voided. Its physical copy, a brittle page from 1983, was quietly removed from the local archives. The clerk assigned to verify it was not informed of the context. She signed off the removal as routine sanitation and returned to her coffee. Next came employment logs. The Department of Justice database showed an inactive profile. Larkin, badge 4426A. Precinct allocation closed. The file was replaced with a generic placeholder reading "Record not available." Then the placeholder itself was overridden. No administrator was notified. No supervisor reviewed the change. The system no longer remembered the officer. The system no longer remembered there had been anything to forget. His social security number was deactivated, not flagged, not retired, deactivated. The IRS terminal linked to his filings blinked once, then went dark. All federal employment history, including his pension registration, his health insurance, and his firearm certification, disappeared in a cascade of null entries. There was no ping, no flag, no alert, just clean lines of zeros where once there had been a man. One local newspaper tried to resist the tide. A mid-level crime editor at the Florida Sentinel, having received a tip from an anonymous courthouse clerk, dared to publish a single line in the second column of page 12. Former officer dismissed following classified military incident. The story contained no name, no photo, and no quotes. Within 6 hours, a formal inquiry arrived from the Department of Justice's Office of Information Control. The editor was summoned to a closed-door review board and was issued an official reprimand. The stated reason, referencing a non-existent entity in an official publication may cause misinformation. The reprimand file did not include the name Larkin. It simply cited the incident number void-/43 after the 22/43. At a quiet suburban house 2 states away, a doorbell rang. Once, at 4:03 a.m., a woman in a navy robe, half asleep, opened the door to find a single package on her welcome mat. There was no return address. No courier waited at the curb. She picked it up cautiously, a small wooden box, unadorned except for a government seal on the corner, heat-pressed in crimson. Inside was not a flag, not a medal, not a folded letter, not a photograph. Inside, she found only one sheet of paper, stiff, gray, and stamped with an emblem she had never seen before. At the top, it read, "Final Notice, Kajabaka Closure." Below it, in stark serif letters, the subject formerly associated with this residence no longer belongs to any nation, jurisdiction, or governing system. No further correspondence is authorized. No appeal will be processed. No inquiry will be acknowledged. And at the bottom, beneath a dry red seal, you have no right to claim a grievance. Entity is classified as unacknowledged. The date was typed in UTC. The signature field was blank. She stared at it, not understanding, not screaming, just still. The way the air gets before a storm realizes it's arrived is too late to matter. There was no follow-up. 2 days later, she tried to log into their joint bank account. The screen flashed error 229, invalid account association. His name was no longer on any mortgage, credit card, utility registration, or hospital document. Even the marriage certificate filed in Broward County came back from the search as not found. She went to the courthouse. The clerk looked at her with polite confusion. "Ma'am, are you sure that's the name? We don't have any records of that person." She brought in their wedding photo. The clerk smiled awkwardly. "I believe you, but the system says otherwise." At the National Archives, Larkin's police graduation class photo was missing from the frame in the hallway. His name had been scrubbed from the precinct rosters. The wall-mouth list of decorated officers for 2011 had a gap where Larkin, TM, used to be, not a blank space, a seamless removal, as if the text had rebalanced itself. Even in physical space, his memory had been formatted. The final deletion occurred at the Federal Personnel Identity Server. A single line of internal code was issued. Remove FP 77837, 432. Remove handprint index. Remove voice print. Remove DNA code line B. With one keystroke, Travis Larkin's biometric presence, the very fingerprint of his existence, was severed from the national identity matrix. No agency, civilian or military, could now verify that he had ever walked the streets in uniform, ever spoken on a radio, ever worn the gun that once misfired into the chest of a soldier. He was not disavowed, he was dissolved. And when the last packet of data faded into checksum dust, the Department of Defense issued one last action, a ceremonial legal form, required by protocol but never meant for public use. It was printed only once. in triplicate, stored in 3 separate steel drawers marked OBSOLET/OBSidian, the former end, Certificate of Non-Existence. Subject ID, ER43. Status, executed, not to be domesticated. Cause of termination, Article 34A, strategic compromise. Disposition, immediate nullification. Public record, prohibited. Stamped at the bottom in red block letters. Death certificate, do not publicize. And beneath that, typed in black ink, the line, no system had used in over 3 decades. Subject does not belong to any nation. That paper, and only that paper, remained. 3 pieces, locked away in drawers, only opened when the system needed to remember what it had chosen to forget. Not a grave, not a plaque, not even a whisper in the files of the dead. Just one sentence etched in a box, waiting to be lost in a warehouse of loss. It was no more, no less. No one mourned, because no one could, because in the eyes of the state he had never been alive long enough to die. The certificate of non-existence had barely cooled in its drawer when the tremors began. They weren't physical, not yet, but every encrypted server, every secured terminal, every silent decision chamber began to flicker with the same uneasy hum, as if the system itself had developed a nervous tic. Travis Larkin was gone, erased, nullified, but the act of his erasure had struck something deeper, not a conscience, but a fault line. It started with a report flagged in a routine audit by the Strategic Oversight Division. A minor police department in Kansas had filed a late submission to the National Justice Review System. It contained body cam footage. The timestamp had been edited. The voice logs are muted, but the raw data, buried 3 folders deep, told a story identical in rhythm, tone, and silence to the Larkin event. A stop, a soldier, a warning was ignored, and a gun drawn without cause. The clip was 1 minute, 17 seconds. The audit team didn't blink. By the end of the next hour, 17 more flagged entries surfaced. In Alabama, a corporal had reported a defensive discharge against a reservist in uniform. In Oregon, a sheriff's deputy had destroyed surveillance evidence from a traffic stop involving a National Guard lieutenant. In New Jersey, a retired Air Force pilot was placed in handcuffs during a medical emergency and never filed a complaint, because the hospital had already altered the admission logs, and because the hospital had already altered the admission log. Within 8 hours, the numbers had reached 42. By hour 12, they surpassed 70, and by dawn, the figure breached 122. What linked them wasn't geography, it wasn't agency policy, it wasn't even politically leaning. It was something colder, simpler, the quiet presumption that some uniforms mattered less when wrapped around certain skin tones. The same arrogance that had hovered on Larkin's tongue when he dragged his glove across Aaliyah Monroe's nameplate had echoed, almost word for word, through dozens of mouths in stations, checkpoints, and intersections across the country. Only now, after Protocol 34A had turned one trigger pull into a system-wide shudder, the silence was no longer protection, it was proof. At 5:23 Eastern Time, a classified directive went live. Its code name was Echelon Vale. Its reach was absolute. Every federal, state, and municipal law enforcement database was subjected to immediate integrity scans. The order bypassed warrant protocols. Every active report involving federal military personnel was reopened. Every sealed case matching the Larkin incident's behavioral signature, unauthorized escalation, uniform disregard, lack of probable cause, was quarantined for re-review. The directive was not a suggestion. It was a purge. The algorithm used to detect matching patterns was built for battlefield reconnaissance. It identified behavioral markers, not just keywords. Hesitation, delays, inconsistencies in camera angles, deviations in voice modulation. It lit up the map like a battlefield simulation. By the time the feed reached the Oversight Council's secure war room, the digital map of the United States was bleeding red. Each dot pulsed. Each dot represented a failure. Each dot was the echo of a trigger, pulled without consequence. A general, sitting at the far end of the war room, stared at the display for a full 30 seconds before speaking. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "He's still unconscious," he said, eyes fixed on the densest cluster of red in the southeast corridor. "And still, the entire system bows." A colonel beside him, far younger but no less rattled, cleared his throat. He didn't speak," he said, almost reverently. "She didn't protest, didn't demand justice." "No," the general replied. "She existed. That was enough." Across the war room screen, the map zoomed in automatically, not by command, but as part of the pulse-tracking subroutine. Dots began to cluster. Correlations emerged. Officers with repeat violations. Towns where uniform violations had become normalized. Entire counties with a pattern of disregarding military identification when worn by minority personnel. The software marked them in red, then in darker red, then black. No one in the room spoke. Outside, at a classified military recovery center just outside Bethesda, Aaliyah Monroe lay motionless. Machines hummed rhythmically beside her. Tubes extended from her arm like the roots of something planted but not yet risen. Her chest rose and fell, slow but steady. The oxygen mask obscured her jawline, but not the contour of discipline carved into her face. She looked less like a victim than a statue, not built to grieve but to endure. She hadn't moved in 11 days. But on the 12th morning, as the system around her cracked open its hollow truths, her left finger twitched. The nurse didn't notice, but the biometric sensor did. It logged the movement, time-stamped it, forwarded it to the Strategic Chain Health Monitoring Network. The report did not go to public health, it went to the Joint Chiefs. She was waking, and the system knew. Back at the oversight war room, the map paused. Not by human command, by signal loss. Too many matches, too much exposure. The software froze, overwhelmed not by bandwidth, but by implication. A captain exhaled, leaned forward, and whispered what everyone else already understood. "This wasn't an isolated abuse," he said. "This was a design flaw." "No," the general replied. "A flaw can be fixed. This was a feature." No one challenged him, because now the silence wasn't ignorance. It was consent, and that consent had just become radioactive. By midday, the Department of Homeland Security had greenlit an unprecedented review of police-military interaction protocols. Field manuals were recalled, body cam storage policies rewritten, training modules flagged for ideological bias. 27 precincts nationwide received classified suspension orders for environmental compromise. It wasn't a reform, it was a reckoning, and at the heart of it lay a woman who hadn't said a word, fired a shot, or raised a fist. Her name was coded into the system as Monroe, A-level, 5/Strat. But the soldiers and commanders, the analysts and officers, the policy drafters and ethicists didn't refer to her by rank and simply called her the fault line. Because it wasn't her bullet wound that shook the system. It was the truth it exposed. And when the press finally caught wind of the internal sweeps, their headlines were nervous, vague. Words like post-incident review, classified policy audit, and military oversight alignment tried to downplay what they didn't yet understand. But one image, leaked from the war room, anonymized but too sharp to deny, went viral within 20 minutes. It was a map of the United States, lit with red dots, each dot marking a time, a place, a badge, a hand, and a decision to ignore the uniform in front of them. The caption read, "How many did it take before the system listened?" No name, no blame, just a map of a nation at war with itself, and a woman, still silent, still unmoved, still in recovery, who had made the system remember what it never wanted to admit. She was still, but the system was trembling. The map was still bleeding red when the biometric alert arrived. A single pulse, a flutter, a digital whisper that somewhere inside a sterile recovery room, sealed under 3 layers of national security clearance, the woman at the center of it all had moved. The system logged it without commentary, just a shift in status, vital sign deviation, conscious potential, active. And with that one notation, the tremor that had begun with her silencing turned once again toward her awakening. Aaliyah Monroe opened her eyes on the 13th morning. No gasp, no moan, no cinematic flutter of lashes. Just a slow, unbroken transition from darkness to the cold white of fluorescent light above. Her pupils adjusted with military precision, scanning without panic. She did not ask where she was. She did not ask what happened. Her first movement was not to clutch a wound or reach for a call button. She placed her palm on the side of the bed and pressed. The muscles in her arm flexed, tight, lean, disciplined, as if they had never known weakness, as if the bullet never passed through her chest. The attending nurse, standing 3 feet away, froze mid-step, not out of fear but reverence. No medical chart could measure what that woman had endured. No monitor could translate what her silence meant. Elia turned her head toward the window. It was sealed, reinforced, reflective. She could see herself faintly, face pale, lips cracked, eyes raw. But it was her uniform she focused on, still draped on the chair across the room, untouched since the day it had arrived from the forensic chamber. Olive drab, torn at the seam, stained along the shoulder and chest with dried blood, her blood. She said nothing. The nurse cleared her throat gently, unsure if it was protocol to speak first. "Colonel Monroe," she began, voice cautious, "you've been unconscious for 12 days. The doctors—" "I need that uniform," Elia said. Not a request, a directive. "But," the nurse started, glancing toward the fresh set of fatigues folded beside the sink, neatly pressed, unstained, new. "I said," Elia repeated, this time looking the woman in the eye, "I need that uniform." The nurse didn't question again. She placed the torn garment on the bed without a word. 15 minutes later, Elia stepped out of the private room. No escort, no camera, no metal-bearing officer to greet her return. Her boots clicked softly against the linoleum floor, and the blood-stained olive green clung to her like memory. She had not cleaned it. She had not stitched the tear. Her dog tags, slightly bent, dangled over the still visible dried smear across her left breast, a brownish-maroon halo around the letters U.S. Army. The hallway went silent. Doctors paused mid-page. Nurses froze mid-step. Patients leaned forward from their stretchers. No announcement had preceded her. No press release had been issued. But they all knew. Elia Monroe was walking again. A young intern, barely 23, stammered a half-salute, unsure whether to stand or retreat. She passed him without a glance, her spine straight, her steps measured, her silence louder than any speech he had ever heard. By the time she reached the lobby, 2 officers from military intelligence were already waiting. They offered a clipboard, a voice recorder, and a formal request to speak on record to the Joint Committee on Military Accountability. He didn't even slow down. "Ma'am," one of them called, tone polite but insistent, "there's an entire division waiting to hear your account. Public pressure is—" "I'm not here for the public," she said. They exchanged a glance. One tried again. "Would you consider issuing a statement? The country needs—" "I don't issue statements," Elia cut in. "I follow orders, and, unless I've been dishonorably discharged, I believe I'm still active." "Of course," the officer replied, slightly flushed, "but the media—" "I'm not media." Her voice was cool, even, weaponized by restraint. She stepped past them, never raising her tone, never increasing her pace. At the entrance, a junior aide rushed forward with a phone in hand. "Colonel, CNN is requesting a live segment. MSNBC has sent 2 trucks. You're trending in 46 countries. There's a military analyst in Paris calling you the Silent Storm." Elia stopped, turned. "I'm not a storm," she said. "I'm a soldier." And with that, she walked through the double doors. Blood still dark across her uniform, light catching the crease of her untouched rank. Outside, a fleet of armored vehicles waited at the edge of the hospital's restricted perimeter. They didn't blare sirens. They didn't salute. They opened the door. She climbed in. Inside, a commander sat with a briefing tablet open. "Colonel," he nodded, "are you ready for debrief?" She looked out the window. The landscape blurred past, smooth, orderly, clean, unlike her. "Just take me back," she said. "Back where?" "Back to the mission," she answered. Whatever it is now, he didn't ask further. The ride was silent. News crews swarmed outside the perimeter gates. None were allowed past. Aaliyah didn't see them, or maybe she did, and simply chose not to acknowledge. One cameraman held a sign that read, "Speak for us." Another, "You're our symbol." She didn't wave, didn't glance, didn't blink, because that wasn't why she wore the uniform. At the gate of the base, a young lieutenant stood at attention. His eyes welled, not out of pity, but out of the awful, shaking realization that the woman in front of him had been shot in uniform, and still came back, in that same uniform, to report for duty. "Welcome back, ma'am," he choked out. "I never left," she replied. Her boots clicked against the polished floor of the operations center. The flag above the briefing table fluttered under the soft current of the vent. She stood before it, her chest rising slowly under the pressure of dried blood and policy failure. General approached. "Colonel," he said, voice firm but not rigid, "we're prepared to offer you administrative leave, counseling, full media protection, whatever you need." Aaliyah looked at him. "I need a sit-rep," he frowned. "You're asking to return to command?" "I'm not asking," she said. He nodded slowly. "Very well." As he turned to gather the documents, she added quietly, almost an afterthought, "And don't clean this uniform. Don't stitch it, don't cover it up." He paused. "Understood." She stepped into the next room, where a digital briefing screen displayed a list of active directives. None had her name. One acknowledged her absence. And still, somehow, every directive had been born from her silence. From the hallway, an aide whispered to another. She didn't make a speech. She didn't even look at the cameras. She didn't have to, the other answered. Back in her quarters, untouched since the day she was airlifted out, Aaliyah removed her boots, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened her journal. She wrote 4 words, "I was not done." Then she closed it. She didn't cry, didn't pray, didn't breathe heavier than necessary, because she wasn't there to feel history. She was there to finish the job. The words she had written in her journal, "I was not done," didn't leave the room. Yet somehow they spread like an electrical impulse through the institutional walls of the base, past the iron gates and chain-of-command corridors, through secure networks, and into the bloodstream of a military culture that had, for too long, grown desensitized to its own silences. It wasn't a speech, it wasn't a press conference, it wasn't a movement born from hashtags or slogans. It was something quieter, more lethal, more enduring. A moment when the absence of noise spoke with the gravity of a verdict. And across the country, from old barracks in Tennessee to forgotten outposts in the Mojave, thousands of veterans woke to a silence that suddenly felt different. They saw her photograph, taken candidly by a hospital intern, leaked not for fame but because truth sometimes finds its way through the smallest cracks. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't staged. It showed Aaliyah Monroe walking alone, back straight, boots blood-dried, uniform untouched, staring forward like the war was still ahead. On her chest, just beneath the frayed threads of her nameplate, the stain of the bullet that had not killed her had bloomed like a second rank. The stain of the bullet that had not killed her had bloomed like a second rank. No caption was needed. Then, one appeared. "I could be her." 3 words. Not viral, not marketable, but true. The first person to repost it was a Marine Corps combat medic who had retired with a fractured spine and a medical discharge that no longer paid his rent. Then, a Navy communications officer who had served under 4 different administrations, each one pretending not to know where the cracks were. Then came a pararescue airman who hadn't spoken on camera in years, who simply shared the image and wrote beneath it, "She never dropped the salute." Within 72 hours, over 20,000 uniformed and former uniformed service members had posted their versions. They dug up old black and white deployment photos, added digital overlays of blood smears across the left breast, not to mimic pain, but to acknowledge the threat that a uniform alone could no longer guarantee safety, especially when worn by certain bodies. It was not a protest, it was a remembrance, but it cut deeper than any chant. The media tried to catch up, but they were too late. By the time the morning shows began scheduling roundtables, the movement had outgrown debate. It wasn't policy, it was memory, and memory, when shared across generations of warriors, becomes its kind of weapon. A retired admiral white-haired and stone-voiced, appeared on a live satellite feed with a faded ribbon pinned to his lapel. The host asked him why the image had struck such a nerve and why so many decorated officers were stepping out of silence. He didn't blink. He didn't blink because he had seen men die for less than what Aaliyah had survived. It's not because she's a black woman, he said, slow and cold. It's because she was a critical link in the chain, and we almost let her snap. The silence on set was immediate. The host fumbled for a follow-up, but the Admiral continued, eyes hard, voice unshaking. "Do you understand what it means?" he asked. "For a nation to train someone to protect its sovereignty, entrust her with strategic clearance, and then nearly lose her to the arrogance of a street stalk?" He didn't wait for an answer. "This wasn't a mistake," he added. "This was a moment of reckoning. A single bullet woke us up." Then he leaned back and closed the feed. No apology, no embellishment. Just an old man with rank enough to say what everyone else was afraid to admit. One wound had reminded a nation that its armor was not infallible. From there, it didn't take long for the visual campaign to evolve. Military bases began organizing unofficial photo sessions. Officers in dress uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder, blood-stained patches printed and pinned precisely over their left breast pockets. The photos were not submitted to official defense outlets. They went directly to the people. Twitter, Telegram, Signal, private Facebook groups for retired brigades, even encrypted veteran forums lit up in synchronized recognition. The message was clear. We are not symbols. We are warning signs. Each post carried the same caption, sometimes typed, sometimes scrawled on a piece of cardboard held up beside a fatigued, sun-weathered face. I could be her. In Kansas, a woman who had served in logistics posted a side-by-side photo of herself in 2005 and again in 2025, first in the desert, second in her driveway, holding her daughter. The caption simply read, "You see a mom. They saw a threat. I wore the same flag." In New York, a Vietnam vet platoon leader who hadn't spoken publicly in 2 decades recorded a 22-second video in which he saluted Aaliyah's image on screen and said, "She kept her mouth shut and the world started listening." No press outlet knew what to make of it. There was no leader to interview, no cause to endorse, no grievance list to frame. The movement defied narrative gravity. It was made of ghosts, of silence, of a quiet moral exhaustion that had finally found its avatar, and that avatar had not asked for followers, had not demanded justice, had not smiled for cameras. She had simply stood up, walked forward, and not changed her shirt. One bullet had passed through Aaliyah Monroe, but it had torn through the illusion that discipline could shield identity from suspicion. And as that realization spread, the response wasn't tears. It was order. It was protocol. It was a formation. Those who had once saluted because of obligation were now saluting out of something rarer. Shame. In the Pentagon, the Public Affairs Division requested a formal statement from Aaliyah. She declined. Twice. The third time, they offered to write it for her. She replied through an encrypted channel, "I don't speak for the system. I outlived it." That message leaked. No one discredited because no one dared. Later that week, a ceremonial flyover was scheduled for Armed Forces Day. At the last minute, one of the lead pilots requested that the flyover break formation above a designated sector, one mapped precisely to the area where Aaliyah had been shot. The request was granted. As the jets roared overhead, they shifted into a diamond pattern. Then, for precisely 4 seconds, one jet peeled left, leaving a visible gap before the others reformed. It was subtle. It was elegant. It was exactly the kind of tribute Aaliyah would never ask for, and exactly the kind the system could not deny. By the end of the month, military academies across the country began adding a new slide to their ethics module. The image was always the same: a woman in uniform, blood on her chest, no medals, no microphone. The caption never changed. "I could be her," I said. And yet, she had never said a word. The echo of formation jets over Bethesda had not yet faded from the sky when the summons hit Capitol Hill like a silent detonation. It wasn't broadcast. It wasn't scheduled. It arrived in sealed envelopes, hand-delivered by Department of Defense couriers bearing clearance tags usually reserved for wartime escalation. The envelope read, "International Oversight session. Code black. No aides, no press, no optics. Just 27 members of Congress, 2 generals, 1 Secretary of Defense, and the weight of a classified act that had never before seen legislative light inside the chamber. Cold, concrete, designed for containment, not consensus. The tension didn't build, it waited. Lights hummed overhead in brutal symmetry. No flags. No anthem, no indulgent ceremony, just a blank screen on one end and, at the other, a wall adorned with a single printout framed in hard steel. The words were crimson, stamped without apology, "Exceptional Justice." The Secretary of Defense stood in the center, not with a binder or a briefing tablet, but with a plain manila folder in his left hand and an unreadable stare on his face. No introductions, no small talk. He flipped the folder open and slid a single document across the table. The original copy of Protocol 34A, signed, stamped, and blood-inked, slid to a stop in front of the ranking members of the Armed Services Committee. No one reached for it. One congressman, barely into his second term, cleared his throat with the kind of theatrical gravitas that usually played well on C-SPAN. "Mr. Secretary," he began, "are we to understand that a federal agency executed a U.S. citizen without trial, without media oversight and judicial process?" The secretary didn't blink. He didn't lean forward or raise his voice. He simply looked at the congressman like a man studying a child who had never seen fire. "No," he said, "you are to understand that a U.S. citizen violated the sanctity of our nation's highest-level strategic defense assets and was neutralized under laws you voted to renew." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. A veteran senator from the Midwest tightened his grip on a pen he hadn't used in 10 minutes. Another, older, shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement. He had seen this play out once before, in another country, under different colors, and with less restraint. The younger congressman persisted. "Sir, with respect, even under wartime, you were not there when the blood hit the asphalt?" The secretary cut in, his voice suddenly cold steel. "So don't raise your voice now that justice has been served." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was surgical. It dissected every ego in the room. One congresswoman, known for her staunch rhetoric about constitutional boundaries, folded her arms, trying to steady herself against what she perceived as a quiet coup dressed in national defense. "We can't allow individual departments to dictate life and death." "We didn't dictate anything," the secretary replied. "We enforced consequences. There's a difference. One requires paperwork, the other requires courage." The screen behind him flickered on. Grainy security footage filled the frame. Aaliyah Monroe, standing still, arms raised, eyes forward. No aggression, no provocation. Then the gunshot, then the blood, then the collapse. Someone whispered, "My God!" The secretary gestured, not to the footage, but to the red-stamped words on the wall behind him. "This is what exceptional justice looks like. When the law does not account for its failure, force must be recalibrated." "About at what cost?" another voice asked from the end of the table. He turned slowly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The cost," he said, "was exactly 1 bullet, fired by a man who thought a uniform only protects the right shade of skin. If that cost rattles your sensibilities, you're welcome to draft a better system. But until then, the rest of us will ensure it doesn't collapse on the next Monroe." The younger congressman tried one last push. "Are you telling us that what happened was just—" "No," the secretary said. "I'm telling you it was necessary." He walked toward the exit, then, folder in hand, the silence cracking under his heels like ice over a river about to thaw. But just before he reached the door, he stopped, turned back, and gave them the line that would later be transcribed, misquoted, debated, and never forgotten. "Law is supposed to preserve order," he said, "but sometimes it's order that needs to be rebuilt by those brave enough to hit back." Then he left. The room didn't erupt, it imploded. The footage was shut off. The document was retrieved. The lights dimmed to save power, but also, perhaps, to prevent the senators from seeing themselves too clearly in the reflections on the polished table. No one walked out with raised voices. No one called for a hearing. No one leaked the video. because the truth was uglier than politics. The truth was that a bullet had exposed the scaffolding of privilege under the skin of policy, and now the men and women charged with writing the laws could no longer pretend they didn't know what happened when those laws were used to shield the wrong people. In the days that followed, no joint statement was issued. Instead, key military appropriations were quietly reworded. Language around jurisdictional oversight was modified. Language that once read civil military conflict zones now reads strategic asset engagement zones. The difference was just 6 words. The implication was tectonic. Journalists speculated. Think tanks drafted theories. But none of them could reach the heat of that room. They hadn't heard the secretary's tone. They hadn't seen the wall with the words burned into it like scripture. Exceptional justice. And far away, behind the walls of her command unit, Aaliyah Monroe resumed her duties. She did not hold press conferences. She did not testify before Congress. She did not smile for the cameras waiting outside the base. But if you look closely at the photographs taken of her, each one taken without her consent, each one analyzed frame by frame for the slightest hint of emotion, you would see the same thing in every single shot. Not defiance, not rage, not pain. A stillness. The kind of stillness only possessed by those who know the law isn't there to protect them, but that they can still make it tremble anyway. The silence she left behind in that congressional chamber did not trail her like an echo. It paved the road ahead. Aaliyah Monroe walked back into the rhythm of military life not as a symbol, not as a survivor, but as a calibrated piece of infrastructure that refused to fracture. And yet, even without speaking, without demanding, without retaliating, her presence carried the unbearable weight of judgment. Not theatrical, not moral, structural. She did not raise a voice to accuse the system. She stood still until it accused itself. The invitations came first. The Department of Veterans Affairs offered her the keynote address for their upcoming Resilience Through Service Gala. She declined. 3 networks requested exclusive interviews. Decline. A national newspaper submitted a 10-question profile request. Decline. The Joint Chiefs extended an invitation for her to appear on Armed Forces Day as a guest of honor. She responded with one line, "I was already honored the moment I didn't fire back." The system didn't know what to do with that kind of refusal. In an age of optics, branding, and narrative warfare, her denial of the spotlight wasn't defiance, it was recalibration. Every camera that lingered on her exit was forced to pan down, cut short, or settle for the back of her silhouette disappearing through restricted doors. She didn't smile for the public. She didn't wave. Her silence was no longer passive. It had become confrontational by sheer contrast to everything the world expected from its heroes. When a congressional liaison gently suggested she consider writing a memoir, she looked him in the eye and said, "I don't publish trauma. I process it." His mouth opened to reply, but he stopped, because that wasn't a rejection, it was a lesson. Outside her base, protests had fizzled, not from apathy, but because protest had evolved into posture. Images of her had outpaced slogans. Even in stillness, she had forced an architecture of accountability. Her lack of vengeance confused the media. They wanted fury. They expected rage. But all she offered was existence, unbent, unedited, unforgiving. A reporter finally caught her in frame one morning as she stepped through the gate at sunrise. The shot was grainy, but precise. Her hand rested calmly against the holstered sidearm on her hip. It wasn't drawn, it wasn't even unsnapped, but the message was unmistakable. She carried it not to retaliate, but to remind. That photo was later used in dozens of op-eds, each trying to interpret what the posture meant. But none of them understood that Aaliyah wasn't signaling resistance. She was embodying it. The weapon at her side was a tool she never used, but the memory of what had happened when she wasn't ready had become her new armor. A journalist from a progressive magazine asked for 5 minutes outside the wire. She gave him 2 sentences. "When I was silent, he pulled the trigger," she said. "Now I stay silent, and the system trembles. That's enough." He tried to ask a follow-up. She walked away. There were whispers, of course. Some called her arrogant. Others said she was wasting the momentum, that she should be speaking at universities, rallying with veterans, pushing for policy change. But those who had worn the same boots, those who had counted seconds under fire, understood what she was doing. She wasn't hoarding her power, she was preserving it. Aaliyah Monroe had learned that in the politics of perception, sometimes the most radical act is to endure without commentary. When a Medal of Honor nomination was floated in an internal email chain, she rejected it before it reached the second inbox. "I don't accept medals for surviving systems that broke themselves," she wrote. Her commanding officer, a seasoned colonel with a chest full of decorations and a voice carved from Afghanistan's dust, read the message and smiled, not because he agreed, but because he knew she wasn't speaking for approval. She was correcting the metric. One morning, a cadet approached her near the range. His voice shook, not from fear, but from conviction. "Ma'am," he asked, "how do you stay so composed, knowing what they did?" She looked at him for a long time, then placed a gloved hand over the pistol on her side. "Because I didn't raise this," she said softly, "but I still survived theirs. That's not revenge. That's correct." The cadet saluted. She didn't return it. She just walked past, boots pressing gently into gravel like punctuation marks at the end of truths the world didn't want written. And still the world watched. Billboards went up, some sponsored, some spontaneous, a silhouette of her figure from that now famous gate photo. No name, no title, just 5 words in bold black print. She didn't speak. We did. It spread. In classrooms, in recruiting offices, in briefings, in silent moments before shift change. She became a checkpoint of thought, not because of a quote or a headline, but because every system that had once assumed it could survive unchallenged now had to look in the mirror and ask what would happen if the next Aaliyah didn't hold back. The strength she carried wasn't mythic, it wasn't cinematic, it was functional, it was terrifying. It was what happened when power met patience and refused to flinch. In one internal memo circulated through the Department of Defense, a training analyst described her influence as the gravitational pull of discipline applied at strategic silence. No one rewrote that sentence. No one dared. She wasn't angry, she wasn't vengeful, she wasn't broken. She was unchanged, but the world around her no longer was. And one day, as she passed through the outer checkpoint under a gray morning sky, another photo was taken, this time intentionally. It showed her standing at ease in front of the gate, one hand resting on the cold grip of her untouched sidearm, her expression unreadable, her body language flawless. The caption was added by a civilian later that day. "I don't need her to shout, I just need her to stand there, so they remember what it means to aim wrong." She didn't ask for monuments, and she didn't pose for portraits, but sometimes history finds its lens, especially when silence refuses to fade. The day the photo resurfaced, it didn't come from the Department of Defense or a news wire. It came from a man who had followed her once through dust, shrapnel, and firestorms, and knew long before anyone else did that Aaliyah Monroe did not walk for cameras. She walked for meaning. The image had been taken 5 years earlier, on the outskirts of Najaf, Iraq. A firefight had ended less than 12 minutes prior. Smoke still clung to the air like breath that refused to exhale. The rubble of a crumbled mosque framed the shot. Aaliyah, younger, but no less composed, stood on a slab of broken concrete with the American flag raised in her left hand and her right hand clenched, not in salute, not in resistance, but in anchoring. Her jaw was clenched, her stance braced. She wasn't looking at the camera. Her eyes faced the horizon, as if she were already seeing the country she'd eventually have to challenge to remember what it owed her. That image had never gone to print. The photographer, a veteran named Corwin Dempsey, had submitted it to 4 publications in 2020. All declined. Too severe, too distant, too lacking the intimacy audiences respond to. One editor had said, "She looks like she's ready to leave the flag behind." So the file had been archived, forgotten, buried beneath decades of digital warfare ephemera, until now Dempsey found it again after seeing her face on a silent billboard in Georgia. He didn't say anything. He didn't call his agent. He opened the raw file and stared at it for 3 hours straight. And then he opened Photoshop, not to beautify, not to sensationalize, but to let the image finally match the moment. With a single motion, he added a new layer. A dark crimson smear, faint but deliberate, began spreading from the center of Aaliyah's chest, just beneath the patch where her badge had once rested. It was not gory, it was not exploitative, it was restrained, controlled, like her. The blood was false, the pain it invoked was not. He saved the file and uploaded it, not to a gallery, not to a store, but to an anonymous folder with a public access key. It took less than 12 hours for the file to explode across veteran channels. Within a day, it had reached foreign military boards. Within 2, it had gone global. No caption, no watermarked, no explanation. Just her, standing as if carved from wind and conviction, with the American flag in one hand and a blood echo on her chest. And still, she refused to look at the camera. That's what broke people. Not the blood, not the symbolism, but the way she stared through the frame, as if she had already known that the country she served might one day aim at her and that she would survive it without lowering her stance. The image was reprinted, painted, tattooed, and woven into murals. No one could find the original photographer. Dempsey had refused to comment, but every corner of the internet now pulsed with her gaze, not as a victim, not as a martyr, as permanence. One thread on a veterans forum wrote, "I never believed in icons, but I believe in whatever she's looking at." A high school student in Minnesota printed it on canvas and submitted it to a regional art show. The judges refused to classify it. They didn't know if it was a protest, a tribute, or a prophecy. It won anyway. A military ethics professor at West Point printed the photo, laminated it, and placed it above the whiteboard in every seminar he taught. His caption, "Don't look at the blood, look where she's looking." No one spoke during those lectures because there was nothing left to say. At a Pentagon think tank, a civilian strategist reviewed the image during a debrief on cultural shift post-incident. He studied it for 17 seconds and then closed the folder. His comment, "This will outlast legislation." In one silent corner of the internet, a grieving mother who had lost her son to friendly fire shared the photo with only one line beneath. He didn't flinch. Maybe if he had seen her before that day, he wouldn't have either. No one disputed it. No one politicized it. No one tried to copyright it because this image didn't belong to the system anymore. It belonged to the fault line, the rupture, the thing that forms in a nation when its heroes are forced to be warriors. And still, Aaliyah said nothing. When asked in a classified media clearance if she would allow the photo to be used in future recruitment campaigns, she replied with the same steel she gave to every question she didn't owe an answer to. "I never signed up to sell war. I signed up to survive it." The image kept spreading. Not through train, not through marketing, through need. People needed it to exist because it said what no doctrine, no constitution, no policy could articulate in a language this country still pretended it spoke. Dignity through survival. And in the end, the most piercing detail wasn't the flag. It wasn't the backdrop of ruin. It wasn't the simulated blood across her uniform. It was the distance in her eyes, as if she had always known. As if she had looked past the lens and into the future and seen exactly what would happen when a nation forgets who holds the line and who bleeds to keep it from breaking. The image of Aaliyah Monroe, silent, blood-stained eyes locked into something the rest of the nation hadn't yet dared to face, was still circulating through digital veins when the Pentagon acted. This time, it didn't wait for a committee. It didn't ask for a vote. It didn't host a press conference with flags and assurances. It drafted something older than rhetoric and colder than comfort. It drafted a structural change. The order came at 300 hours, signed with urgency and finality. Pentagon Directive 24-197F, Civil Military Engagement Protocol Reconstruction. Its language was not poetic, but its implications were thunderous. Effective immediately, all individuals operating in active or reserve military capacity, when in uniform or displaying identification during a lawful duty transition, were to be granted the same protection clearance as federal strategic assets. Specifically, Tier 1 federal agents, diplomatic security personnel, and Level 4 nuclear logistics command. No uniform was to be questioned under threat. No badge of service was to be treated as a suggestion, and no bullet was to find a chest like Aaliyah Monroe's without the system being torn down to its studs. The language was surgical. The intention was war. Across internal networks, departments that had grown used to interpreting regulations with ambiguity now received the message in unforgiving clarity. From this point forward, to fire upon a uniform is to fire upon the state. It was not hyperbole. It was doctrine. The Department of Justice, long resistant to overlapping definitions of authority, was forced into immediate interagency retraining compliance. All local, county, and state-level law enforcement agencies were given 90 days to recertify under a newly implemented Uniform Integrity Compliance Framework, a policy packet that ran 417 pages and began with one unmistakable sentence printed in bold red font. Do not presume threat where service is displayed. The order stripped no officer of power. It did not emasculate precincts or neuter force protocol. What it did was more dangerous. It clarified who stood where on the battlefield of rights versus assumptions. For decades, the lines between military and civil law had blurred whenever it was convenient to blame or ignore. This time, the blood hadn't just dried. It had etched a boundary no department would dare cross again. Field manuals were rewritten. Use of force modules were paused mid-semester. Recruit training nationwide was halted for 72 hours to integrate the Monroe Doctrine, as it came to be known unofficially. There were objections, of course. One sheriff in Arizona went on record calling the directive a political overreach masquerading as protection. He was removed from office 2 weeks later after internal audits revealed that 4 cases matching the Larkin signature had been sealed under his watch. The National Police Union attempted to issue a formal challenge to the directive's enforceability. They were reminded, privately, that Protocol 34A had not expired. In high-security briefing rooms, across subterranean chambers and encrypted lines, officials murmured phrases they had never used in policy drafting sessions before. Words like dignity, architecture, symbolic containment, and reactive recalibration. But behind the buzzwords was one unavoidable reality. The system had been caught lowering its weapon in one direction while lifting it in another, and Aaliyah Monroe, by refusing to retaliate, had exposed the balance that no longer held. A new document circulated, attached to every squad car dashboard, every tactical tablet, every officer field kit across the continental United States. It wasn't glossy or friendly. It wasn't designed to inspire. It was there to remind the equipal, protel, uniformed, individual interaction. Section Level 1. If individual is in recognized U.S. military uniform, active, reserved, retired with identification, do the following. Do not initiate physical engagement unless there is an immediate and demonstrable threat to life. Do not reach for a weapon unless said individual has drawn first. Do not raise your voice above standard operational tone. Do not question the legitimacy of the uniform unless directed by Central Command. Risk civilization, penalty, strategy interference / protocol violation / Article 34A exposit. The memo ended with a final line typed in all caps: assume strategic value until proven otherwise. And just like that, an entire system that had once hesitated to extend the benefit of the doubt to bodies wearing service fatigues of a certain color now found itself required to do so, or risk annihilation not just of careers, but of institutional legitimacy. The nation didn't explode. It adjusted. In every academy, recruits were asked to memorize not the name Monroe, but the phrase, "Service is not selective." On day one of restructured training, instructors led with a new directive. Uniforms are not suggestions. They are contracts. Break that contract, and the state will no longer protect you, it will correct you. That line circulated faster than any viral video. In a military town in Texas, an officer who once bragged that he could smell a fake soldier in a crowd now reads from the Monroe Directive in every morning briefing. In New York, a precinct commander implemented weekly evaluations of officer responses to uniformed citizens. In the first week, 12 failed. The second, 3. By week 3, all had passed. The cultural shift didn't come from guilt. It came from threat clarity. No one wanted to be Larkin. No one wanted to be erased. Meanwhile, Aaliyah Monroe continued to operate under a classified assignment. She didn't speak at policy panels. She didn't sign autographs. She didn't make commercials for service pride. But her name became a firewall in every federal interface. Do not engage Subject Monroe without strategic clearance. And though she never read the document that bore her legacy, she felt its impact when she walked through an airport checkpoint in uniform. No one asked her to remove her boots. When she crossed through a patrol unit in a domestic deployment corridor, no one asked for her rank. Not because they feared her, because they feared the blueprint she had become. A system once designed to protect its hierarchy had been re-engineered by the stillness of a woman who never shouted, never sued, never struck back. She walked with a weapon she never used, and rewrote how the nation defined the cost of a uniform. Because sometimes, the loudest reconstruction is done not with demolition, but with memory. And in every system that had learned to mistake silence for weakness, the lesson was now printed, not in law books, not in newspapers, but in field manuals, under one brutal sentence. If you fire at the uniform, you fire at the Republic. The directives had been signed, the manuals rewritten, the language of authority recalibrated. The system, once reluctant to correct itself, had been forced into reform by something that didn't come from legislation or protest. It came from endurance, but no line of policy. No security protocol, no revised tactical briefing could prepare the international military community for what would happen next, because not everything that shifts a nation's axis comes with permission. The summit had been scheduled months prior, a global defense forum bringing together the highest-ranking officers, defense ministers, and strategic advisors from 49 countries. It was to be held in Geneva, under layers of neutral flags and polished statements. The agenda was supposed to cover standard deterrence, satellite arms escalation, and joint cyber command initiatives. No one expected the room to fall silent because of one woman's presence. Not announced, not scheduled, not pre-cleared for media optics. When Aaliyah Monroe entered the auditorium, she wore no ribbon, no rank adornment, no ceremonial sash. She wore her standard-issue combat uniform, the same one she had been shot in, now stitched at the chest and scarred at the shoulder. Her boots were dusted from use, not parade. The sleeve on her left arm remained rolled down, discreetly hiding the surgical scar that trailed from bicep to elbow. The light overhead caught the polished edge of her nameplate, not cleaned but burnished with time, and for a brief moment the entire hall stopped moving. They stood, not all at once, not by instruction, not from protocol, but one by one. Generals, colonels, presidents of war colleges, heads of armed forces from nations that had built empires and watched them fall. They rose, not for her rank, not for her record, not because a flag told them to. They stood because they had read the briefings. They had studied the directive. They had seen the image. They had known fear. But this was not fear. This was recognition. The kind that doesn't arrive with applause, but with the silence of men and women who realize they're standing in the presence of something rarer than legend, survival with consequence. She walked with purpose, but not performance. Her posture did not scream pain, it whispered discipline. Her eyes were not hardened, they were focused, alert, unblinking, like someone who had seen the law hesitate, had felt the steel of its misjudgment, and had risen not just to walk again, but to walk differently. There was no introduction, no music, no teleprompter. There wasn't even a podium. She stepped to the center of the stage, where nothing had been prepared, just concrete beneath her boots, and overhead light that did not flatter, only exposed. The shadows from the rafters carved across her form like brush strokes from a battlefield artist. And when she spoke, her voice didn't echo, it struck. "I'm not here to represent fury," she said. "I'm here because someone fired a bullet in the wrong direction, and I am what's left of the ricochet." No applause followed, because no one claps for the truth when it comes without decoration. The officials, seated behind glass interpreter booths, paused their feeds. The translators hesitated, not from technical failure, but from the weight of finding the right words in their language for what she had just said. Aaliyah continued, "I did not survive because of policy. I survived because I stood still. And when I stood still, the system moved around me." She glanced at the front row, not at the uniforms, but at the eyes. Eyes that had seen coups and insurgencies, that had led battalions through forests and slums, that had buried soldiers with honors they never had time to wear. And now they watched her, not because she demanded anything, but because she refused to ask. "I do not speak to reclaim dignity. I never lost it. I don't carry vengeance. I carry what the bullet left behind, an imprint, not of death, but of failure." She lifted her left hand, not high, not theatrical, just enough to place it gently against the center of her chest, where the fabric had been stitched back together with military precision. No blood, no badge, just the impression of impact. "They tried to aim at fear," she said. "They hit memory instead." Still no applause, but some breathed differently now. She closed her fingers into a fist over her chest. "This uniform is not sacred because it's military. It's sacred because I wore it when they forgot what it meant." One of the highest-ranking defense ministers in the room leaned forward in his seat, his fingers laced, his brow tight with thought. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to, because she was not here to prove anything. She was there to make them remember. Under the cold spill of halogen lights, the stage floor creaked beneath her boots. Boots that had once pressed into the sand of Fallujah, into the tarmac of Bagram, into the polished marble of courtrooms that never deserved her presence. Now, here, they pressed into silence. She said nothing for 13 seconds. Not because she was gathering herself, but because the room had to. Every eye in the chamber was tethered to her breath. Every diplomat, every delegate, every figure carved from ceremony and hardened protocol, waiting not for a spectacle, but for absolution they did not deserve. The podium was untouched. She stood apart from it, deliberately. Her file had been circulated prior. 3 wounds, 2 deployments, 1 betrayal. No commendation had followed, but she had outlived every man who denied her one. On the 3rd row, Colonel Rhett Langley shifted in his seat. His mouth twitched with the memory of a briefing he'd once led about her, not with her. In that briefing he had laughed, loud enough to leave a chill in the room. If she didn't want attention, he'd said, maybe she shouldn't have worn the uniform like a second skin. That clip, unreleased for years, had surfaced last week, played across feeds and stitched into 1,000 condemnation videos. Now, sitting across from her, Langley's eyes did not meet hers. His command had been quietly dissolved. His pension stalled. His mailbox was stuffed with patches burned at the edges, with only her initials scrawled across the back. On a naval base in Guam, a training mural that once bore his likeness was painted over, not with slogans but with silence. The space left white, like an omission screaming louder than any portrait. Back in Washington, former Senator Dale Mycroft walked with his head down through Reagan International. 5 years ago, he had written off her trauma as an unfortunate misunderstanding of protocol. Yesterday, someone posted footage of him boarding first class while TSA officers recited their final words in unison behind him. The passengers applauded. He said nothing, but the next morning his speaking tour was canceled by every venue, citing a shift in audience conscience. On the digital front, an anonymous admin leaked records of a judge's ruling, the one who had refused to press charges the day her assailant claimed qualified immunity. Those records were posted across veterans' forums, overlaid with a quote she had never spoken, but which felt authored in her silence. Cowards don't misjudge, they just choose which pain to protect. The judge has not been seen in public since. Still, she did not refer to them. She did not gloat. She did not name. She did not nod to the purging that had begun beneath the polished veneer of bureaucracy. Instead, she stood still, and when she finally spoke, it was without preamble. "I'm not here because of what I did," she said. "I'm here because of what I didn't do. I didn't retaliate. I didn't record. I didn't flinch. I existed." There was a hush that followed. Not of awe, but of recognition, a collective awareness that something irreparable had shifted. Cameras were live, but she did not play to them. Every syllable landed like a verdict with no appeal. She let the words sit, then she added, softer but heavier, and it was enough to bring the ceiling down. She gave no closing line, no crescendo. She simply turned, and still no one moved. Not because the moment wasn't over, because none of them wanted to be the first to pretend that it was. As she walked off stage, one international general whispered to his aide, "That was not a soldier speaking, that was a verdict." Another said nothing. He simply deleted the speech he had prepared. The flight was silent, but not empty. It carried the weight of recognition, of questions left unspoken because their answers had become irrelevant. Her name did not echo in press rooms, nor did it trail hashtags, yet in private corridors of decision and defense, it had become a threshold, uttered only when policies teetered, and someone needed to remember what a line looked like once it had been crossed. That night, a senator from New York returned to his office to find the hallway outside vandalized, not with paint, but with copies of the directive stamped across his door, each word highlighted in blood red, the same shade used on the now iconic image of her chest wound, fabric stitched, heart spared, authority undone. His staff said nothing as he tore the papers down. 2 hours later, a junior representative resigned mid-section, not because of a scandal, but because her inbox overflowed with emails from retired veterans who had served with Aaliyah and no longer accepted silence as an acceptable response. In one cafe in Arlington, a former police chief tried to order coffee only to be handed a cup with her quote printed on the side. "I existed, and it was enough to bring the ceiling down." He left without a word. His department's past disciplinary reports were anonymously released that same week. Across the city, a news anchor who once referred to Aaliyah's silence as strategic manipulation was interrupted mid-broadcast by the control room director herself. Feed cut, mic dead, station switched to public service messages. By morning, that anchor's apology aired not from a studio, but from the steps of a veteran memorial, where a crowd of 300 stood behind him, not with signs, but with uniform. None of them clapped, none of them spoke, but when the camera zoomed in, they could all see the pins on their jackets, replicas of the same stitched pattern where her blood had once soaked through the fabric. Inside the defense headquarters, a wall once reserved for portraits of decorated commanders had one frame quietly replaced. No announcement. No unveiling, just the photograph taken in Iraq years ago, now restored and reframed but without her name, because no one needed reminding. The room around it grew quieter each day, as if her image dictated a reverence louder than citation. No one questioned the change. They just stood longer in front of it. And in the academy, where cadets trained to recite protocol with precision, one instructor broke the pattern. She asked a room of recruits what it meant to wear the uniform. No one answered at first. Then one raised his hand, not to speak, but to place it over his chest in silence. It was enough. In a world where consequences rarely matched intentions, her presence rewrote proportion. It was not revenge, it was realignment, because from that moment on, every time a recruit stepped into uniform, someone in the room would remember that there had once been a woman who had been shot for wearing it, and who didn't just survive the bullet, but outlive the world that fired it.